Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see some people here to listen in the graveyard shift. Hopefully nobody falls to sleep after lunch. I'm in a bit of a quandary, actually, whether to wear my glasses and look at the screen or to walk around, because there's not much distance here. So I'll find where things pan out. But I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about some questionnaire-based work that's been supported by the SPATEX Foundation, and that's around exploring the health and well-being benefits of cold water immersion, but particularly in relation to ice baths and cold plunge, and hopefully provide some take-home messages in relation to, or moving towards, evidence-based insights for industry. So just for context, some industrial context to begin with, of course we're aware that cold water immersion is a rapidly growing market. There's been a shift from its use with early athletes into general mainstream wellness. And of course, what people buy is dependent upon what their perceived expectations are in relation to health and well-being benefits. And with cold water immersion, there's a lot of purported benefits, like reduction in anxiety, improvement in mood, improved immunity, improved sleep quality, increased quality of life, improvements in pain, reduced aches and pains, and the list goes on and on and on. But what of that is real? What of that is credible? What's got a scientific basis in relation to that evidence, and what is hype? We're in the early days of research and fully understanding the potential of cold water in relation to health and well-being. And of course, if we have credible insight, we can communicate that to the public. And one thing we can do is improve our product and sales as a consequence. It's also obviously useful for industry to understand behaviour of users, and that can support safer product design. And likewise, if we understand individuals' motivations and their barriers around use, that can feed into product development and also some differentiation within a brand and across brands as well, depending upon who we're focusing or targeting. So as I've alluded to already, industry really needs clarity on what the benefits really are, what user motivations are, how people perceive what those benefits are, the actual behaviours, how is that product used, and what are the barriers for use. And then if that information exists, guidelines can be developed and revised, evidence-based, in order to inform usage and get the optimal health outcomes. And a scientific approach to begin doing that, and only to begin doing that, is to have conversations or find out from people who are using cold environment what they perceive those benefits to be. So as an initial starting point, what we've done is designed a questionnaire, a simple online questionnaire covering and asking for information around all of those areas that I've already alluded to. And that questionnaire took people on average around about 20 minutes, so maybe a little bit longer than you would ideally have. And participants were recruited via social media platforms and personal networks. And you would hope and expect, if you get something like this online, to get thousands, ideally tens of thousands of respondents. The crunch issue is that we ended up with 136 respondents so far. We're hoping to expand that. Maybe we'll streamline the questionnaire as a consequence of the feedback that we're getting. And when we clean that data and come up with usable individual information, we've got just over 100 respondents. But in saying that, it does provide some useful information and insight that I'm going to share with you. The participants of these characteristics, there was a broad age range. We've got from 22 to 80 years old in our cohort. The average age of people using cold water immersion was around 50. Males, females, non-binary individuals represented. Body mass index, calculated by weight divided by the height in meters squared. And the range there is quite big. We've got 17.8 to 41.8, which takes us from people who are underweight to those that are class 3 obese. So a whole broad range of individuals and body types using cold water immersion. And in this cohort, the average duration was 3.5 years of experience. But again, we touched upon people who've just been doing it for a month, as well as individuals who've been doing it for 31 years. So people who were ahead of the curve there. And as is important in any investigation, we got some general characteristics. Our population were relatively well educated. 75% having a bachelor's degree or a higher degree. And that's important to understand when we're dealing with the data here, because the answers might be very different from other populations, and accessibility to cold water immersion may well be limited in other populations, or at least different in other populations. So if we're considering long-term health benefits, making that available to individuals is a potential issue to consider. Around the globe, the majority of the participants were from the UK, then the US. There were some from Australia, New Zealand, a few from Canada. There was somebody from St Nevis, if I say the right way round, somebody from Estonia, and a couple of other European countries. So broad representation. 2/3 of the people had never smoked. 1/3 had smoked in their life, but didn't currently, with only a few currently smoking whilst using cold water immersion. Around over half the people would drink alcohol on occasion. That seems quite reasonable to me, but that's a personal thought. And the range of physical activity was dramatically variable between individuals, from next to none to high levels of activity for 1 to 2 hours a day for at least 3 to 5 days a week. So people. So body size, body dimensions, levels of fitness and levels of physical activity varied quite dramatically. So the exciting bit, or the beginning of the exciting bit, we need to get excited at this time of day. What are the reasons and why are people under water immersion, and how important do they consider the reasons that they're undertaking it to be? So what we've got here along the top are some variables. We've got enjoyment, invigoration, relaxation, so on and so forth. And then across the roads, how important people consider that to be. What are their experiences? Picked out a few high-ranking values here. People are doing this because it makes them feel invigorated. They're reporting perceived reductions in stress. It helps with anxiety. It relieves aches and pains. That's what people are feeling, that's what people are reporting, and they're saying that that's important to them. And if we look at some other variables, pick out some high numbers, they feel it improves their circulation and the ability to recover from injury. And other elements we can pick up on there, improved sleep and improved recovery from exercise, amongst other things. So really important elements, and people also considering that cold water immersion is used as part of medical therapy. And there's a little bit more data on that as we go along. So what mode of immersion are people in this survey using? And you'll see that the numbers there are expressed in a percentage, and there's more than 100%. And that's because we've got this 103 respondents, but 181 responses, because people are using more than one mode of cold water immersion. Okay, but the most popular one they're using is in the home, purchased ice bath or plunge pool. Lots of people are using a cold shower. Nature, really important. Lakes, rivers, waterfalls and so forth. Really important features and exposures. So moving on, those that have invested in cold plunge or ice baths, how much are they spending? Over 25% of people over £1,000. We didn't ask any higher. Some people below £100, and that's where people are being using their powers of improvisation, plastic tubs in the garden, old chest freezers, adapting all sorts of bits and pieces in order to get their hit of cold water immersion. And the cloud there is just highlighting some of the common brands and approaches that people answered and responded in this questionnaire. Lumi and MyoMaster being quite common ones, with their variable offerings being under £1,000 or so, as far as I'm aware, but there are other brands in there as well. So how often are people using cold water immersion? Comes as no surprise. The majority of people in this survey have bought their own, so they're using it at home the majority of the time. The other data to highlight in this table full of numbers is that gyms, spas and resorts, in proportionate terms in this population, people aren't using cold water facilities there. They're not accessing them there. They don't seem to need to in this particular cohort. So that's of interest. If we look at what affects the frequency of use, lots of people are using immersion as much as they want to. Nothing is influencing their frequency, and that's getting on for half of the respondents. Time required is a limitation. Aspects around health and safety can be a concern for some people. Outside and they may slip, there could be ice on the ground. There was a lot of seasonal variation in that lots of people were reporting if they used cold water immersion outside that they felt the benefits were greater in winter time when the environment was colder naturally, if it wasn't powered to be cooled, and less so in the summer. They felt they had less benefit in the summer when their cold water immersion wasn't quite as cold. And there's a whole range of other factors influencing the frequency, and if we get more people answering the questionnaire, we may not see a difference in the relative trends, but the numbers are likely to be higher. What time of day are people doing this? It tends to be in the morning, and lots of people report that it sets them up for the day if they undertake this activity in the morning. The time of day is determined by logistical reasons for the majority of individuals. Some people we can see there are choosing the evening later on in the day in comparison to the morning, and some people believe that a certain time of day will give them greater benefits. Okay, but drilling down into the data to understand that is a different factor. Now, one thing that I'm particularly interested in, and we probably all are in general, is how cold and how long are people using cold water immersion for? And the respondents here, we can see around about 25% are using 5 degrees or less. Almost half are using between 6 and 10 degrees. And if we look across at the durations of exposure, the most popular duration of exposure there is between 1 to 5 minutes. Okay, so if we break this down and look a little bit more closely at these temperature intervals, we can see in the top left-hand side that if we're people using 0 to 5 degrees, the majority of them are using that temperature for between 1 and 5 minutes of exposure. There are some hardy individuals there who are immersing themselves in those temperatures for longer periods, some even between 10 and 20 minutes, but less common and probably with a lot of habituation. If we look at 6 to 10 degrees, still a lot of people are exposing themselves for that 1 to 5 minute period, but proportionately a few more for longer durations, as you might expect. And then 11 to 15 degrees, we've got people using longer duration exposure, as you might expect. Okay, and people may be using these different temperatures because they perceive that they receive different effects to those different levels of stimulus. But in relation to how and what those changes and differences are, there's limited evidence as we stand in relation to what the dose response is. What proportion of the body are people immersing is also of interest, and the majority of individuals are going up to neck level. These numbers add up to more than 100% again, because people are using different levels of immersion at different times. But the majority of immersions are indeed up to neck level, and those that are using a cold shower are tending to immerse the head and face for periods of time as well, as you might expect, but not everybody is. And if we look a little bit more closely in relation to ice baths and cold plunge, showers and nature, we can clearly see that the majority of the time people are covering the main surface area of their body and have a high stimulus as a consequence of that. An important aspect to consider is risk around whether people immerse the face and head. My personal recommendation, for a variety of reasons, would be don't immerse the face or head in cold water, because that can result in conflicting stimuli. Your body, the thermoreceptors in your body, are driving your heart to beat faster. The moment you start dipping your face and your head into water, there's a diving response that is elicited where your heart rate will be driven to decrease. And sometimes people can get into difficulties because they've got this conflicting stimulus of the body driving the heart rate up and stimulation of cold receptors and the trigeminal nerve of the face causing the heart to decrease. And you can have this conflict in the nervous system that can result in cardiac problems and arrhythmias. So that's potentially dangerous, but people can become adapted to cold water and they may potentially immerse their head safely, and clearly people do, otherwise they wouldn't be reporting in this survey. But they need to be careful how they do that. They need to have clear guidance in relation to doing so. And that's reflected in the detail here. If we look across the rows in relation to the proportion of people using each of those modes of cold water immersion who immerse the face, the head, and don't immerse at all. So around about a third of people, I think, are being wise and safe and not immersing the face and head, and hopefully the other ones are in an informed way. We asked people about how their practices have changed the current period, and what we found was that very broadly people were saying that they increased the duration of their sessions as time went on. They went for colder temperatures as time went on, and they went for a higher frequency as time went on. And when asked why, people referred to they felt that they'd adapted and the stimulus was effect. And yeah, words like acclimatization and adaptation and improved tolerance kept coming up. So the perception is that people are adapting, and we would expect that if we measure them in laboratory conditions, that there will be adaptive responses that have been experienced. And whether the magnitude, the extent of those adaptive responses varies dependent upon certain thresholds of exposure, whether that be temperature or duration, remains to be evidenced. So what activities do people seem to do whilst they're undertaking cold water immersion? Lots of people just try and relax and sit. People may concentrate on their breathing, meditative types of exercise, and a whole range of other activities across this cohort. So there's lots of opportunity there to integrate those sorts of approaches in the offerings that are on the market. What was interesting was that a lot of people tended to report that this was a lone activity. So the pie graph on the left-hand side there, around 10% of people always undertake their cold water immersion on their own, almost getting on for half, sometimes do it with others, but certainly not all of the time, and 40% or so never do. A lone activity. However, the same individuals are reporting that they perceive it's beneficial to undertake cold water immersion with other people. Right? So there's a bit of a dichotomy there in relation to how people are undertaking this and what their perception is of those benefits. And when asked about those benefits, people were talking about social aspect, community, motivation, camaraderie, all of those sorts of aspects that were driving them on to undertake this activity, and they felt that there were benefits from a shared experience. Okay, so how much of the positive adaptation is around cold water immersion per se, how much is around the environment that is being undertaken within, how much around is it being a shared experience? Again, all of these factors are in the mix and remain to be fully evidenced. Moving very quickly on, I did say we'll be jumping through lots of information quick. What we've got here is how does cold water immersion, how is it perceived to affect mental health? Right, and on the left-hand side there, we've got a scale from much better all the way down to much worse. And the majority of these responses are that people perceive mental health to be much better, and at the very least slightly better for aspects of general mood, for stress, levels of energy, resilience, mindfulness, reduced anxiety. All of these positive aspects people are reporting. And there isn't much consolidated evidence other than anecdotally in the literature in relation to this. And some of this deserves further, more thorough investigation to get the message out there of the potential benefits and to understand the doses that are required to elicit these sorts of responses. Other variables, productivity, confidence, concentration, sleep quality again, all being perceived to be beneficial as a consequence of people taking these cool dips. Around 34% of our respondents also reported having a diagnosed mental health condition, aligned to the general population, predominantly some form of depression and or anxiety reported in individuals. And that's important because these individuals actually perceived that cold water immersion, if we look on the left-hand side, improved their mental health, and their mental health was much better as a consequence of the cold water immersion. And that's with a diagnosed depressive illness and or anxiety. And we can see on the left-hand side there that they are reporting having treatment from health practitioners to various levels. Right? So these are real people with real conditions. And importantly, on the top left, they consider cold water immersion to be part of their treatment, which is an interesting point. And they also perceive, and there are examples of people telling us, that as a consequence of cold water immersion, they've reduced the medication that they require and their reliance on other treatments. However, cold water immersion, the effect, the positive effect it has, seems to vary within individuals and between individuals as well. So it's not fixed, hence why lots of people tend to undertake an exposure at least once a day to maintain these positive effects. But again, how much is enough, we don't yet know. A couple of quotes to consider from a mental health perspective, how positive this is for certain individuals. And we'll jump on to looking at physical health and symptoms and what people are seeing there. So we've got the same scale, much better, slightly better, all the way down to much worse. And we see, again, some strong positive physical benefits. People's aches and pains are at least slightly better. And that's over 70% of individuals. Inflammation, again, over 70% of individuals, slightly better and much better. Perception of improved immunity, reduced muscle soreness, clarity of thought, even breathing, which is of interest for people with respiratory conditions, asthma, COPD, for example. If we look at our population, just over 50% of them had diagnosed medical conditions, predominantly musculoskeletal, back pain problems, disc disorders and so forth, and a range of other disease conditions or comorbidities. Obviously, we've got a limited population, and as numbers increase, that would be useful to be able to drill down into the specific benefits. There is some evidence that cold water immersion, for example, helps with blood glucose regulation, which would be useful for diabetics. Okay, but the perception of the benefit of that, we need more information on, for example. Again, with physical conditions, lots of people are receiving treatment from healthcare practitioners on the left-hand side, but they perceive the cold water immersion is making their symptoms much better, and at the very least slightly better, which is really important. And likewise, they consider that dipping to be part of their treatment, and it also reduces their reliance on pharmaceuticals, other medication, really important. Again, variable perception in relation to how long the positive effects last for, but more frequent immersion at defined temperatures would be useful to understand or develop further understanding around. Just to highlight here very quickly, we're getting towards the end. Next 4 slides going to go through very rapidly, just to consider, are there any adverse effects of cold water immersion? And we've got a range of health variables along the top there, and we can see the proportion of individuals at the bottom in particular have never experienced any of these issues whatsoever, and these issues here are probably no more than in the general population on a day-to-day basis across that cohort. Skin irritation, for example, could be down to hygiene issues with the techniques that people are using in immersion, or basically down to hives if people are having a response to that cold exposure. Could be a range, but the incidence of that is really low, and we could consider each of those individually as well. Further aspects of potential adverse health conditions, again, never experienced by individuals. And if they have been, very few individuals have experienced them, like a headache, for example. People get a headache on a day-to-day basis, quite possibly a false positive there, but that's a very low proportion of individuals. And if we look at the frequency, so those that have experienced any of those adverse effects, they hardly ever have at all. It may have just been once, it may have been twice, not very often. Okay, so the perception is that these sorts of practices are really quite safe. Thankfully, they might be self-limiting. However, it would be useful to understand where the thresholds lie around temperatures and durations, and therefore the volume of exposure to gain the positive effects. And we've got the same here again in relation to the frequency of the specified conditions in the top row there. A couple of quotes that people, or examples of quotes people added to the end of the questionnaire, really positive in relation to reducing medication and benefiting from their lifestyle commitment to regularly use cold water immersion, clearly perceived by some people to be life-changing. So I'll make a brief summary now. I've realised I'm the last one, so I could have spent longer talking through all of that and tried to keep you here and lock you in for the rest of the afternoon. But you may have fought back and pushed me out of the way, I think. So to summarise, this is only questionnaire-based data, but there isn't much out there in the literature, as I mentioned at the start. And what it does do, it highlights the potential practical application of cold water immersion to be used by healthcare practitioners, potentially in the community, potential community prescribing in order to reduce, pharmaceutical dependence and allow and enable people to treat their own symptoms and benefit accordingly. And if people haven't got specific physical and mental health conditions, there are also general enhancements noted by people in relation to mood and well-being that are well worth chasing and drilling down and making known to the general public from a quality of life perspective, if nothing else. So these data can inform industry, and as we develop the number of respondents, stronger basis for marketing products, if we know what people perceive the benefits to be, that can be garnered in that sort of information. User guidance can be optimized. What is best? How is it best to develop and progress? And if we're able to describe the sorts of responses or the magnitude of response that were available to people if they work to the very low temperatures and increase their exposure duration, that would be really beneficial. Okay, is there any input in relation to product design? Potentially in relation to the hardware. Does it cost the same to keep something at 0 to 5 degrees as it does in comparison to 11 to 15 degrees? Are there different designs that can be used to enhance the experience with more than one individual? Can that integrate different facilities for people to undertake activities whilst they're immersed? It's important as well, health and safety. We've heard people reporting hardly any adverse conditions at all, but we do need to make sure people are careful in relation to head immersion in particular. But benefits to be had there. There are limitations, of course, with any data set, with questionnaire-based data in particular. As I said at the beginning, this is from this specific population of relatively well-educated individuals. We didn't ask for income information or salary income or economic banding, but that could also be a factor in what people have available to them, the time that they have available. It would be interesting to reach out to further populations and also work with populations to see what benefits there can be where the opportunity for cold water immersion is less. As I've alluded to, there is a need for more rigorous investigations, more along the lines of what we heard earlier from Dan, looking at cold water immersion and the benefits for older adults in relation to cold water immersion to tease out the benefits and where these thresholds are, and also importantly, what are the physiological and psychological mechanisms that are driving these changes as a result of the stimulus of cold water. And I'll just leave you with this thought. We've outlined some positive benefits, lots of positive perceived benefits of cold water immersion. And if a pharmaceutical company could produce a pill that potentially people could take to give them the range of benefits that cold water immersion offers, they would invest tens of millions of pounds or dollars in order to trial it, in order to optimize the dosage, in order to look at the side effects and so forth. The potential is there with cold water immersion. The investment isn't available from a public health perspective in order to drive that forward, but maybe the industry can do that further. And to be fair, the SPATEX Foundation has funded this little bit of work which begins to go forward towards doing that, which I'm thankful for, and it gives us some insight to develop specific questions into undertaking specific studies. So I'll finish there and thank people. The image there is a shoulder level immersion and some thermography from some pilot work we're doing in the laboratory in collaboration with Brass Monkey around developing optimal temperatures and exposure durations in relation to mood enhancement, which is ongoing work. Maybe in a year's time we'll be able to share that with you. And colleagues here A shout out to Chris Hayes, of course, who's integral to the event and integral to the SPATEX Foundation funding this work to benefit industry as well as my colleagues, in particular Tom Cullen, who was integral with working with Chris and initially developing the questionnaire that we've talked about today. So thank you very much. I'll stop there, and if anybody has any questions, if you don't want to rush out the room, I'll be happy to try and answer them. Thank you.